It is November 5th at 11:06 a.m. and I'd like to call the November 5th, 2021 meeting of the Clean Energy Advisory Board to order. This meeting is being conducted pursuant to the Clean Energy Advisory Board's policy on conducting meetings electronically without an in-person quorum pursuant to Chapter 1 of the 2021 Special Session 2 Acts of Assembly. The meeting is being held solely to receive presentations and updates, public comments, or conduct other forms of information gathering. And no votes will be taken, nor any formal recommendations will be made during this meeting. So I will now do the roll call. Please say present when I call your name. Casey Bliley.
Present.
Catherine Bond. Not present. Taylor Brown.
Present.
Sam Brumberg is not present. Janica Casper.
Present.
Will Cleveland is not present. Hannah Coman, present. Kendall Crawford.
Present.
Bill Greenleaf.
Present.
Kirk Johnson. Not present. Susan Cruz. Not present. Sarah Norette.
Present.
Present. Tony Ostrowski. Will Reisinger. Sam Towell is not present. And John Warren. Not present. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people present. And that isn't quorum, but Grant, I would like the minutes to show that counsel to the board said that the bylaws do allow us to have a meeting, just nothing can be voted on. So we will have that meeting. And the purpose of this meeting is to talk about the Green Bank Market Assessment for Virginia. And we will have a presentation from Bettina Bergu from Virginia Energy. So Bettina, I will let you take it from here.
Wonderful, thank you. I think Erin's going to be kind enough to run the slides. Yes, and I will say I think in the last version of the slides that went out, I still had my DMME email, so just fixed that this morning. But I think that'll be the only difference from what was sent out previously. All right, so let's see. During the last Clean Energy Advisory Board meeting, I did briefly explain that Virginia Energy is conducting a preliminary market assessment to explore the market potential for a clean energy financing authority for Virginia. And I just want to say up front that this term, Clean Energy Financing Authority, or CEFA, which is also an acronym I might use, that refers to this hypothetical statewide green bank. So thanks for taking interest in a follow-up call on this so that we can dive in a bit more deeply and I can get some of your input on some key questions, especially for the market assessment. So let's go to the next slide. So today what I'm going to do is dive into a bit more detail on what is a green bank, and with slides, hopefully a bit helpful for other visual learners out there. And I'm also going to pose the key questions of the market assessment that we're conducting. And then lastly, I'm also going to pose some initial thoughts between the interaction between this currently hypothetical Clean Energy Financing Authority and the Clean Energy Advisory Board in the case that this statewide green bank did become a real possibility. That's obviously a conversation we want to have. So I'll present for about 15 minutes, and then the bulk of the time is going to be to get your input both from the Clean Energy Advisory Board and then also from the public who are present on first the market assessment questions and then also on that Clean Energy Advisory Board CEFA relationship. So let's go to the next. All right, let's start out with what is a green bank. Next slide. So green banks vary in exactly how they're legally structured and the specific activities that they undertake, but the general definition is here. Green banks are institutions that accelerate the deployment of clean energy broadly defined, by the way, using limited public dollars to attract private capital to those projects that are underserved by the private financial sector. So I'll say that what tends to differentiate a green bank activities undertaken by a green bank from other government activities is this focus on financing and a really close relationship with private financial institutions. I will say there's no reason why a utility or a state energy office can't host programs that are hosted by green banks, but green banks are differentiated as institutions in that they are established to be very flexible and very market responsive so that they can evolve over time as the private financial sector evolves and hopefully gets more comfortable with green financing in one part of the market or another. So this really important need for flexibility is why oftentimes green banks are established as independent government authorities or funds rather than sitting kind of within government, like within the Virginia Energy, for example, where they would be a bit more restricted. So next slide. This slide is just to say that, a lot of states are exploring green banks and why. There are about, something over 20 existing green banks across the US right now, primarily on the state level, but some of them on the local level as well. To date, they've driven, as you can see here, about $5 billion of investment into low carbon projects, with $3 of private capital deployed for each green bank dollar deployed. So we would call that a leverage ratio of 1 to 3 of public to private dollars. Next slide. All right, so yeah, thanks. So here's where we can get into a bit of exactly kind of where green banks operate and how they do so in the next slide as well. Green banks are established to fill gaps in the financing market, right? That's where they're additive. So they tend to focus on the types of projects that we all know are really important for decarbonization and for creating green jobs, but that often face challenges, especially related to financing. So those are namely existing building retrofits and decentralized renewable energy. So within those broad categories, you can see here, they commonly focus on existing residential buildings, including LMI, small commercial and nonprofits. This is often termed kind of sub-PACE because these are smaller properties with small projects that aren't really appropriate for commercial property assessed clean energy, which is better for larger projects. Multifamily affordable housing is a focus of a number of existing green banks. And within kind of this existing buildings market bucket, traditionally green bank activity has been in solar and energy efficiency, but as we see kind of market wide, increasingly they're getting involved in electrification and energy storage as well. And also increasingly getting involved in community solar projects and clean transport as, again, those markets expand generally. So I will say just the last thing on the last slide about where market segments where they focus is that obviously where a particular green bank focuses its attention is going to be driven by the prioritization of its objectives. So that could include equity, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, financial sustainability of the institution, leverage ratio, job creation, etc. And so, whether there's a focus on greenhouse gas emissions and or financial sustainability, you can imagine that that would drive attention to one or another market segments. Okay, Erin, now for the next one. So this slide is really wordy, sorry, but I did want it to be useful for those who weren't able to join the call today, just to read afterward. I wanted to get into some details as to what a green bank might actually do. That's really helpful for me. And I'll just run through them. Some of the financing strategies used include offering loan loss reserves or interest rate buy downs to private financial partners. This can help them offer more attractive financial products in terms of a lower rate, a longer term of a loan, or more flexible underwriting, such as a lower FICO score. Another option is extending financing to individual projects that are struggling to access affordable private capital, often in partnership with a private financial partner, but in a more subordinate position, getting paid back later. An example of this that a lot of green banks are now doing is inclusive community solar projects. Thirdly, extending financing to companies to enable expansion into either a new geography, like to come into Virginia, or into a new demographic, like to do more work in a lower income band. And then the fourth thing that I've listed here is standardization of contracts and financial products, especially for small projects, so that those projects and their loans can then be bundled or aggregated and securitized such that, and this is a way to connect small projects to larger capital markets, which can be hard if there's not standardization in those financial products. So I think these four things that are listed here are very kind of financing oriented. But I do want to say that there are really important non-financing activities that green banks undertake as well. Something that I hear, and maybe y'all have heard as well, is just the green bank as kind of a trusted advisor, an objective advisor, and a source of information about all of the different programs that are out there, kind of using the one-stop shop model. And I think we can all understand that for a resident or for a small business, this can be really useful in a place where there are lots of different programs and options out there. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to bring this down now to really how this is relevant to Virginia and what's happening with the market assessment. So let's go to the next slide. As I think I mentioned in our last meeting, localities in Virginia may now establish local green banks. And that is something that I'm looking forward to supporting localities on who are exploring that, which a couple are. But I think we can all understand that there are a few challenges with the local level approach solely. One, that it is resource intensive to establish a new entity. But I think secondly, and more importantly, is the issue of scale. First of all, it does take a certain volume of project pipeline to cover and justify the operating expenses of a standalone institution in a locality. And it also takes a certain amount of scale to engage private sector market participants, be that financial institutions or contractors or others, to get them to be engaged in programs that are established. So because of these issues, Virginia Energy is exploring the potential for this statewide green bank that, again, we're for now terming the Clean Energy Financing Authority. So on the next slide, you'll see that the three questions that I've been posing in interviews that I've been having, some of which have been with folks on the call, so thank you, the questions are threefold. First, what kind of clean energy or climate resilience projects are underserved by the private financial sector here in Virginia? The second one, what existing programs might a CEFA be able to complement, and how might it do so, getting at the very important issue of avoiding duplication? Thirdly, If a clean energy financing authority were to prioritize two objectives, what should they be? And what metrics would help capture performance against those objectives? So hopefully we can get this slide back up a little bit later as we're having the discussion, because I'd love, again, CEAB as well as public input on these. Thanks to those who have already provided your input. Feel free to reiterate what you've said in individual conversations that you've had. And hopefully this is okay. I would love to invite CEAB members to respond in their advisory board capacity, as well as bring in your expertise from your home organization as well. And then the last thing I promised I would touch on the next slide, I think actually probably we can just go to the next, is the really important question that I think Susan Cruz brought up in the last meeting, which is how might these entities interact? And I think at the time the answer was, I don't know, but that's a good question. So let's talk about it. And so I have just an initial list of ideas here for your consideration and feedback. And they are organized starting from least level of integration to the most integration between CEFA and CEAB. The first one being that there's no legal connection between them, but there's close coordination on joint objectives. I think the most obvious example here would be that the CEFA could extend energy efficiency financing for those households that are eligible for the LMI Solar Fund, but do not qualify for WAP. So need some way to get energy efficiency. The second one is that the CEAB serves as an official advisory group on LMI programs that are established. The third option that I see is that CEFA and the associated CEFA fund are established via legislation, and the Clean Energy Advisory Board, probably with a couple of additional membership seats added, is designation as the board of CEFA. And then the fourth one, the highest level of integration, would be that essentially the Clean Energy Advisory Board is transformed to serve as a statewide green bank, whether or not it's called the Clean Energy Financing Authority. And for that to happen, of course, legislation would have to be passed expanding its mission, authority, and membership, and a new fund I think would have to be established that has a bit more flexibility than the LMI Solar Fund that currently exists. So those are all my slides. I think the last thing that I want to say is just that I'm going to be taking all of the feedback that I've received through this market assessment and put it into a report that's going to be ready around the end of the year or very beginning of next year. And then that's going to serve just as an educational resource on this idea of a statewide green bank moving forward. So that's my time. And again, I'll just reiterate what I would love to get from the discussion is both feedback on those market assessment questions, if maybe we want to put those back, and also on the interrelationship between the entities in whatever order people feel like. So the rest of the time is kind of for y'all.
Thanks, Bettina. Yeah, I would like to just open this up to questions and comments from the board at this time. So feel free to just unmute and ask away.
Hey, Bettina, Bill here. A few comments, thoughts. So we don't have community solar or shared solar in Virginia yet, but it's coming under regulation, and multifamily is now enabled, but Dominion is, and the bill tariff for multifamily shared solar has not been settled yet. But on the community non-multifamily shared solar, effectively July 2023, I could see the critical role for the Clean Energy Financing Authority would be to provide credit enhancements for banks to provide loan capital to those projects, since the subscriber base can drop in and out at any time. It creates a little more risk than a traditional power purchase agreement to municipal school system or one single off taker. That's one comment. The second thing I want to say is that our organization bank has working with the DC Green Bank. We partnered on a multifamily low-income solar kind of community solar loan in DC, and the partnership has enabled us to make that loan because they're taking a little more risk than we were willing to take, and so that partnership was critical to providing that financing to the borrower. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. Do you mind if I ask if in that partnership with DC Green Bank, is the Green Bank taking a subordinate position in the transaction? Is that how it's structured?
Yes, yeah, they are. So quick, our loan gets paid out in 5 years and their loan gets paid out in 10 years, like their portion of the loan. So they're taking a longer risk and kind of letting us be paid first. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. That's a great example.
Bettina, I have a few questions just kind of on the structure and the premise and some background. One example of a green bank that I've heard favorable reviews of is within NYSERDA. And is it true, and I haven't checked this, so it's just an open question. Is the NYSERDA Green Bank, is it part of NYSERDA, and is it just then like fully a public entity? And then
sorry.
Then as a follow-up question for that is, you had mentioned that in that case, there's more restrictions on how the funds are used. And I would just like to kind of understand better what those restrictions are and like why we would choose to have it be the public-private partnership. And I know you talked about it a little bit, but I would just like to hear a little bit more about that.
I think that's a really good question. It's something that I should learn more about because in my experience, New York Green Bank, which is a part of NYSERDA, I haven't heard from them. I mean, I've worked really closely with them and I haven't heard them say, we haven't been able to do this thing because of our legal structure. And that might be in part because more of the restriction on their end is financial sustainability. So they are revenue generating, or they're profitable, and so that's been like more of the restriction rather than being within government. So yeah, in New York Green Bank's case, I don't know actually what the real ramifications or implications, if you will, is of being within government. It seems like, they have an investment committee like any other fund would, and that hasn't seemed to be really restrictive. So yeah, something I should learn more about.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about that as well. So if you find any additional information, and I guess the real reason is because, looking at examples, like that's one that's a lot of developers and community solar have told me are doing really good work. So I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, and it may be that, they're still set aside and they have their whole own staff and branding and kind of identity. And I think from what I've just heard from Green Bank advocates and staff, I think that's really important for private sector market participants to see it as a standalone entity, even just perception wise, right? Even if there aren't real constraints to investment criteria or anything, just feeling like they are separate and can be kind of flexible and more private sector focused rather than being within government is important. So maybe it's that they are technically within government, but they are kind of separate enough that that perception, issue is managed. But yeah, I'll look into it and follow up with you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And then my second question is that one thing that we've comment. One thing that we've run into on the board is that there are a lot of kind of different types of funding resources available, different financial mechanisms, different amounts for kind of different people with different qualifications, whether it's through, you know, the RGGI funds and Department of Housing, or if it's through the Clean Energy Advisory Board, or if it's through Virginia Energy. And I was just wondering if there has been kind of a full audit, if you will, or analysis of kind of all of the different segments that we have in Virginia for funding of renewable energy. Probably maybe in Virginia and federally, like that would be open to people, so that we could try to figure out, you know, if this green financing entity were created, could we move all of them through there, or how could they complement those existing ones, so that we don't just have this like piecemeal approach that could be redundant?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And part of the market assessment, a really important part of the market assessment reflected in question 2, has been that existing landscape analysis, you know, starting from the point of, one, are there financing gaps in the market? You know, I didn't come in with any preconceived notions on that. I think I have found that there are some, including, you know, even one that Bill brought up earlier. So I think an important first step, if something like this were to be established, would be, you know, differentiate in terms of market segment, you know, maybe work in a certain type, building type and income band that isn't addressed, right? And that would be just working in different market segments. And so there wouldn't be duplication there if there is that like serious gap. One example that, just to illustrate that, would be in the commercial sector, you know, Virginia is rolling out the statewide CPACE program, and that's for bigger commercial projects. And then a Clean Energy Financing Authority could work in the small commercial space. And in that way, they would just be complementary, both working in commercial, but different parts of the commercial market. I think the more need for coordination would be if there are existing programs that serve a market segment that a Clean Energy Financing Authority would supplement in some way, you know. And I think obviously something like multifamily affordable housing with high E would be one. One thing we know about high E is that it can only expend funds on energy efficiency, but not solar. And so solar is a technology market gap within this market segment. And so then the question would be, okay, if a Clean Energy Financing Authority provided financing support for solar in high E eligible properties, how would those work together seamlessly? Because something that I've heard from the market assessment participants is that, you know, timelines and streamlined processes are going to be key, because oftentimes when you have a bunch of different programs, if the timelines don't work out, then you have a property owner who has to choose between this program or that one, which isn't what we want. You know, ideally they would be able to work together. So
yeah, and yeah, no, thank you. I think that was great. And yeah, I see, you know, our input is requested on this. I guess one question I have is, in addition to soliciting input from, you know, people that work in the field, which I think is exactly, you know, what we should do in a really important way, who else are you soliciting input from on this point? And is it, you know, kind of part of the administrative, you know, part of the administration, like reaching out to the different departments and getting their feedback as well?
Yes, absolutely. Government agency partners has been a major focus of the market assessment. So been speaking with a number of different agencies about what they're currently offering and whether, you know, how those programs are performing, and whether they have any challenges that a Clean Energy Financing Authority might be able to assist with addressing, and also if they see any market gaps that they just haven't or don't have the authority, or for whatever reason, you know, aren't addressing. Yeah,
Thank you. That's great.
sure. And I'll just add to that, just on the government side, I have a lot of different categories of stakeholders that I've been talking to for the market assessment. But in addition to the state level agencies, I've also had a lot of conversations with localities. I know that Susan asked the question last time, who at the localities? So that was a really good question that I had a follow-up conversation with her about. It has been primarily sustainability folks and some economic development agency folks, but I'm also talking to them, right? Because we've got state level programs, but also local level ones. And so even if there's coordination on the state level, there would have to be complementarity between what the state level options are and how they work with local programs. And so anyway, what I'll say about that is I think ongoing coordination and partnership with localities, either, informally or through some sort of advisory group, would be really important to ensure coordination on that state local level as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Hey, Bettina, David Brown here. Appreciate the presentation here. Really excited to see this rollout. My experience is more angled towards solar, and so I know that there's probably a lot of energy efficiency that I'm not super up to speed on. So my comments and questions will be more focused towards solar. Historically, as a developer and long-term owner operator of solar in Virginia, rate subsidy or rate buy downs we see as really valuable. We did a project a few years back that used the Virginia Saves program. That was like an interest rate subsidy, and it was very successful and enabled a project that otherwise wouldn't have been feasible to happen, really. And I think thinking about the mechanism through which funds are dispersed, I think that an efficient way is to funnel them through existing folks and existing organizations that are lending out or that are providing services out to the market, to prevent a lot of admin work of someone trying to kind of get straight to the projects, but something more at a high level, working through existing framework to get funding, through those groups to lower the cost of capital. Seems like an efficient structure. I don't have a ton of green bank experience, so I'm not sure how others are configured, but from a solar perspective, just interest rate buy downs and enabling longer term. So, if a bank is trying to do a swap agreement and, that's expensive and they can't get to 25-year fixed rate debt, an angle that you all could provide is enabling that longer term to get that cost of capital down.
Thank you so much. And when you say, just so I fully understand your comment, when you say existing funding channels, that would be like traditional as well as mission driven or specialized clean energy banks or funds.
Yeah, totally. The organizations that are out there talking to the folks who have tangible projects and they understand how to vet those projects. I think what's really important is that this bank conception isn't getting into the business of diligencing. It is not diligencing projects, right? That work needs to be done by people who are experts in the field, and you all would be providing financial support to make those projects more viable, from a financing perspective, to just eliminate more administrative burden on you all.
Thank you. And I know that right now we're showing the market assessment slide. I don't remember what the timing is, but I also want to encourage anyone who wants to be brave and have thoughts on the last slide as well. I welcome that feedback now or later.
I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but I'm happy. I have a lot of comments. I always have comments and thoughts, so I'm happy to share that to keep this moving. So on this initial list of options for consideration, I think this is really important to think about. And I'm really happy that you're bringing this up, Bettina, because I think there's a lot we could do here. So I think number one would be a missed opportunity. So I hope that we wouldn't go along with that. And for those that are on the phone, number one is no legal connection with CEFA and CEAB coordinating on joint objectives. I think that would be difficult, and I think there should be like a formal connection between CEAB and CEFA. And part of that is because I can't imagine trying to explain to legislators why the CEAB needs funding outside and separate from the Green Bank. Like I don't know how you can make that argument. So I think we need to really simplify and streamline things to make it efficient and effective. I could imagine the board serving as an official advisory group on LMI programs and just really keeping that kind of high level advisory role. I do think, though, that wouldn't solve the problem of the funding sources, because I think that sounds like it would still be separate funding sources. Is that right, Bettina? For number two?
That's a good question. I guess I could see a universe in which CAB retains its capacity to manage the LMI Solar Fund and operates on and serves that function, and also serves as an official advisor group, so that there are kind of two funding channels. If if the LMI Solar Fund weren't somehow brought under the Green Bank. So yeah. Either way, I could see.
Yeah. So I think, the funding example, I think it would be difficult to have it be separately funded. So I think that's kind of a point for me. And then I think number three and number four definitely could work. I don't really have any issues with that. I do think that, the Clean Energy Advisory Board and its mandate to create this rebate or fund or, loan for LMI customers in Virginia for solar is really well within what I'm hearing this this CEFA would be tasked to do. So I do think kind of bringing it together would make sense. I think my one concern, and this kind of goes back to NYSERDA as an example, is whether we would be losing some efficiencies and talent and know-how by having CEFA be outside of Virginia Energy. And in addition to kind of like understanding how CEAB and CEFA would work together, kind of what would be the role of Virginia Energy too. So I think that'd be helpful to understand.
Yeah, thank you. And can I just clarify if the concern is having a CEFA not within Virginia Energy or not within Virginia government?
Yeah,
I think the authority structure would be within government still, but as an independent authority. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think the open question is, how would Virginia Energy work with CEFA? And I think the concern I would have is just, Virginia Energy has been doing great work in this realm, right? Like in doing programs for low income customers. So how would that be dealt with within the fund? And so it's more of an open question than a concern, but just kind of like that's part of this as well.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. I do have a couple conversations coming up with existing green banks, getting into the nitty gritty of how they work with localities. And I will add to that how exactly they work in partnership with their state energy offices, and what the relationship is there, and how they leverage the talents and institutional knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I would be open for like 2 through 4 in some capacity, to really, you know, be explicit on that. I can see that working. I do think, you know, if the CEAB were expanded, we would need to get some more people on the board that have kind of direct experience with green banks or other kind of financial mechanisms like this.
Bettina, is there any existing structure in which you all are looking to deploy, or is it really like trying to talk to folks and seeing what other people have had success with at this point?
Yeah, we're definitely in exploratory stage right now. So in my visioning, you know, where I'm coming from is based on what's out there right now and what's been successful right now. So that's why, you know, I even use the term authority, clean energy financing authority. And so I have to say that I do kind of default to the idea of an kind of independent quasi public authority, because that has been a bread and butter governance structure of green banks, but there are other options, that's for sure. So right now, to answer your question, you know, we can be flexible.
Hey, thanks, Bettina. One of the things that I think you mentioned earlier in your presentation was development of the objectives and the metrics. And it just had me thinking similar to what Hannah was commenting about NYSERDA, and the discussions or kind of stakeholder solicitation from the government level may have not been as focused on the actual individual community member, and may look for larger scale returns. And so I would agree and advocate for options kind of 2 through 4 here, but I think defining exactly what those objectives and metrics will be very important as you move further up the number scale there.
Yeah, definitely. And Casey, if I may, do you have any thoughts as CEAB or from Veridian's perspective in terms of core objectives you'd like to see?
Well, I think overall energy reduction for a broad base of community members. And, you know, I think, again, it goes back to the audit and assessment of programs and financing options that are currently available and ones that are not, and thinking through what are those products. You know, I kind of go to buildings or systems. What's the ownership structure? Is it an individual, privately owned? Is it a rented facility, or is it a municipality? Thinking about the income served or not served, and just making sure that we're thinking broadly about energy efficiency and clean energy, really to move the entire scale, kind of where I think I'm going with that. I can also see that that might not always agree with if the objectives are strictly for the fund to have high energy returns. I would anticipate, as you noted, that those are going to be much larger municipality kind of led projects that are going to have a higher return. And so striking that balance, I think, will be important.
Yeah, thank you.
I do want to allow a few minutes for public comment. So if we can pause for a minute, and Aaron, if you can help me open up the lines for public comment, and then we can kind of reconvene after that.
Sure, yeah, if any public wants to comment, please just raise your hand or type a question in the chat, and I will moderate that. Not seeing any questions at this time.
Well, and I will say, from what I'm seeing on the participant list, it's a lot of familiar faces or familiar names. So y'all know where to find me. Feel free to reach out later if you have thoughts later. Would love that.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Bettina. Opening it back now up to the board. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? I think there's a lot of kind of still good open questions out there that need to be addressed.
Certainly for the purposes of the preliminary market assessment report, I will say on the issue of interaction between CEAB and CEFA, probably the extent of what I would say is just that the conversation needs to be had, and perhaps that has begun, but that's really it for now. And then we can continue separately outside of kind of the market assessment, this preliminary market assessment.
Yeah, and on that point, Bettina, like, do you have any kind of sense on, like, it just seems almost overwhelming, right? Like how many like open items there are, like the structure and the objectives, and I think this market assessment will likely point us in certain directions. But is there kind of any order of operations in terms of like this needs to be established first, and then we can move on to this question and, you know, kind of subsequent questions?
Yeah, so generally what happens is there are often a lot of open questions, even when a green bank is established. And legislation or executive order, or if it's just an independent nonprofit, you know, a nonprofit is established by whatever means a green bank is established. And then at that point, and the legislation or other establishing statute is quite broad, saying that the mission is to accelerate private investment in low carbon projects, basically. And here is the governance structure. There should be a board and maybe what constitutes that. Once it's established is when the board comes together, and if it's not stated in the enabling legislation, let's just say, things like objectives are decided, things like operating procedures and investment criteria, you know, all of those governing documents and protocols are established. And that's also when a more in-depth market assessment and market sizing would happen, to really say, okay, we have some sort of idea as to kind of where there are gaps in the market, but let's really talk to market participants active in those market segments and understand where are the pain points, you know, and what specific types of activities can we undertake to address them, you know, specific financial product, specific type of contractor training, you know, that level of detail is not something I'm getting into now. My initial review is kind of where are there gaps and what are they broadly, and then it comes later to say, you know, this is what the market gaps are now and how we can address them. So you know, in the case of existing green banks, a lot of that does come later. And again, the point of the enabling legislation being really broad is so that it can evolve over time. What we don't want is to say the green bank will be established, it's going to do X, Y, and Z, because then it can't change based on the evolution of the market.
That makes a lot of sense and helps me kind of focus too, because it seems like the enabling legislation would be really, like, if it's so broad, you really have to figure out the structure.
Yes, the most important thing is legal structure and governance structure.
Yeah, yeah.
And if there's going to be any parameters on, you know, specific parameters as to what it can support financially or otherwise, you know, probably using terms from the Virginia Code related to energy efficiency programs and renewable energy, et cetera, that kind of limit, you know, limit what type of energy it would be able to support.
I think we all want renewable energy and energy efficiency in this.
Yeah.
If anybody else have anything to add on that point? I, but yeah, I think that would be key.
Yeah.
And I think I 100% agree. Just keeping it broad so that there's flexibility makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. But of course, you know, for this reason, deciding on the governance structure and board is incredibly important because that leaves so much to be decided by this board.
Right. Yeah, we only have a few minutes left. Does anybody else have any additional comments? Okay. Yeah, I think, Bettina, I really appreciate your time in coming and talking to us. I think these are really important questions. I for one, think that the Clean Energy Advisory Board has a lot of expertise on the issues that we've been discussing, you know, energy efficiency as well as solar and low income customers in Virginia. And so I hope that the board's expertise can be utilized under this new structure. So thank you so much for your time and your preparation for this. And like Bettina has offered, if anybody has any additional follow-up, please reach out to her. And for the Clean Energy Advisory Board, I think the next things, we're continuing to do some stakeholder outreach. Please send me an email or put your information in that spreadsheet that I shared. And I know that the policy committee has a meeting on Tuesday in Charlottesville. And then I think the next big thing will be, I believe CESA's continuing to work on the RFP. So we would be in, the board will get an update on that at some point. Anyway, with that, unless there are any objections, I will adjourn the meeting. Any objections? Hey, the meeting is hereby adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time and input.
Thanks, everyone.